Okay, for those joining this live stream, we are talking about the entity framework for Wolfram Language, and entities are things in the real world mostly. And let's see, I think we were primarily trying to talk about the way of generalizing hierarchies of entities and so on. I think we've talked about.
It was more the second part, yeah, not this one.
Okay. All right. Okay. So what we had talked about last time, we got some background noise there, by the way, had to do with this notion of domains of discourse. And I think what we were talking about was, let's see, can somebody summarize here? We were talking about entity types. All entities of that type have the same set of properties defined. Then we're talking about the question of how, for example, a species can have as sub-entity types. Yeah, how does this work? What is our way of thinking about that?
We were discussing what is the relation between the named entity classes and own entity types that are subtypes. That's one of the discussions where we didn't have come to totally clear conclusions.
Right. Right. So hold on, let me just go and put this in the right place. Let's see. Michael, you might want to adjust your microphone. Okay. So let's talk through the question of species, for example. So we have, potentially we have an entity type that is, an entity of type mammal, which we don't have right now, right? And the whole point of that is that almost everything, in a given entity type has the set of properties will be usually not missing or not non-defined for most of the things in that given entity. But I think what was our idea here about domains of discourse?
This was, I think, if we have something that is a little bit underspecified, that the domains of discourse tells us what it actually is, which viewpoint to take to consider this thing.
Okay, but how does that relate to the entity specification? I mean, so there's a notion of, okay, so here we have entity types, right? Lots of entities that have a common set of properties, and where nothing similar also shares all those properties. Right? So in other words, if you're saying an entity of type mammal, that's because for a mammal, you can ask things like, what's their gestation period, which makes no sense if it's a reptile or something, right? Yeah. And there is, and similarly, if you're dealing with a book, you can ask things like, how big is it? Which makes no sense if you're dealing with a work, because that is the abstract content of, Gone with the Wind. You don't get to ask how big is it, how many inches is it across. It's a non-question, so to speak. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay, now the question is, how do we maintain, what does it mean when we have this hierarchies of of concepts, effectively. So, for instance, Ethan on our live stream is pointing out that we currently have a representation for the class of mammals, which is an entity. Well, that's an entity. What the heck is that? What is that? Is that an entity class?
It's an entity.
That's a mess.
Yes, and we are redoing it.
Okay. Okay. All right. So hierarchy of concepts. So we've got mammal, and certain properties of mammal are relevant. Now, what was our idea here? I'm sorry.
I think the idea was something like I think you had some gold or something, and so what is gold? Is it an atom? Is it an isotope? And you had this domain of discourse that kind of gives you a hint on which viewpoint you want to see it.
I see. So in other words, we might have a notion here of a concept. So we might imagine something like a concept that is, and then we might have a domain here, and then something like whatever it is, gold or something. I don't know whether that's the right thing to imagine it as. And then this becomes, then that has multiple entities that correspond to that concept with different.
Right.
So in other words, what's that?
I mean, Ian had this suggestion, which I liked, which is slightly similar. We have a one argument form, gold, that then can be instantiated to a two argument entity.
Okay, so his suggestion that it was entity gold like this, that then depending on the domain of discourse instantiates to.
Yes.
I see. Okay.
Well, Surf already does this, but not like that. Surf has this notion, the Semantic Relations Framework has the notion of entity type hierarchies and what is a member of what, and also abstract entity types. And so you might have an abstract entity type of a character with concrete instantiations that are person and fictional character. And those are, two separate branches. And then under person, you can have NFL player and MLB player and so on. And of course, it's possible for someone like Deion Sanders to be both an NFL player and an MLB player.
More than I know, but yes. Okay.
And for gold,
yeah.
Yeah, for gold, and Jason S is the expert in this, according to the proper IUPAC nomenclature. Like, they are not really all hierarchically. They are also a lot of next to each other, like gold as an atom versus gold as an ion, and so on.
Yes, I understand. So Jeremy, tell me what the design of what's now in the surf is.
Well, I tried to just explain that, but also
what's the actual design in terms of function names and so on?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So the entity head is used there, although slightly differently. Well, actually, not that differently. So it is in fact the entity and then the type, comma, the standard name, and it is always two argument entity. We don't have the single argument entity that Michael just mentioned. But of course, it's possible the surf realizes that if you're referring to entity MLB player Deion Sanders, then because of the hierarchy, that's the same entity as the person Deion Sanders.
Okay. I want to know, how is this entity hierarchy? What actually happens? I mean, in other words,
right. So it means that Deion Sanders, by virtue of being these things, has all of the person relations, all the person properties. It has all the character properties if we actually had that abstract entity type. it would.
Okay, I get it, but I want to know what the actual function names are and so on.
Right. So
see, notable chemistry problems. That's pretty stupid, right? That's pretty stupid, and probably is not,
Yes and no, I would say. That's an interesting case. Is it stupid or is it not stupid? It's stupid in a pragmatic sense, definitely, but not in an abstract sense, I would say.
No, I agree.
Okay, good.
Okay, but then, it's not stupid in the same sense as how many fins does a camel have is not stupid.
Exactly.
In this particular case, this is the wrong answer. The correct answer is he didn't have any.
Correct.
Right?
But of course, unfortunately, it is very hard for all the professions to properly curate really what each individual has achieved. So it's very hard for us to differentiate in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, like for instance, here, it could be that Van Gogh had discovered some pigmentation, some
exactly. There might well be a chance he has discovered some chemical thing.
Right. Okay, but let's come back to how the current self-implementation works.
Right. So I don't have all the function names off the top of my head, and I'm not going to claim that there's a one-to-one correspondence either between how the surf operates and how the Wolfram language entities work. But that there is a notion of entity type hierarchy. There's a notion, you can ask if a particular entity belongs to a particular entity type. There's no notion of entity classes. Instead, entity classes are just another entity type. And so that's how you get mammals as an entity class of species, is just by having the entities belong to that entity type as well. So it really is a hierarchy.
And this is probably also a subtle topic, like most people would probably don't think of mammals as an entity, but say without ULMS in the anatomy, the standard explicitly specified they are entities even if they have sub-entities. So what exactly constitutes the entity versus the entity class really depends on the domain of science who specifies the wording.
Well, let me give an example of that. For example, bats, or no, let's say sharks. Okay. I might say it's a shark, but actually that's just a random cartilaginous fish. There are many, many, many different kinds of sharks, so to speak. And what's my point? A shark could be thought of as an entity, but in fact there are many sub-entities.
Right.
So a shark.
Or in anatomy, a finger. Like, which of the 10?
I see. Might be an entity or an entity class. Yeah, well, I think that, maybe Tony can say something about the RDF view of all this stuff. Is Tony here?
So in RDF, there are no restrictions. You can use any object as entity or as class. However, in OWL, which builds on top or can be expressed in RDF, you have a little bit stronger thing. So you can declare a thing as either being a named individual or a class. But then with OWL 2, you can also do this punning where you can define a certain IRI is both a named individual and a class. But depending on the context, it's always clear which aspect is meant. And to give an example, a person can be of a certain profession. So in this case, profession is a class to which certain persons belong. But then a profession can also be an instance, a named entity that has properties by themselves. For instance, what do instances of that thing do? What do people of a certain profession do? That could be a property.
Okay, so they haven't solved any problems here.
And I think there's one more viewpoint on this.
Yeah.
Like, it is either an entity or an entity class, as you have written. And then, as we currently do with the implicit entities in food, it is an entity that arises through some kind of coarse graining.
I see.
When you say it's a shark, you don't mean average over all sharks. But if you say here's a chocolate chip cookie, in the absence of any further information, it is an average chocolate chip cookie.
Yes. Actually, worse still, an average cookie.
Right.
Okay. All right. So let's go back here to thinking about what it means to have this concept of. See, yeah, I don't even know what this is. I mean, is this some translation of natural language, or what the heck is this? Because this has so many different things with different, the gold. Let's not pick gold. The copper ion, the +1 ion, the +2 ion, all this kind of thing, and they might all be being referred to as copper.
Right. I mean, one of the advantages of this abstract one is if we would apply a property that, say, comes from a certain entity type, as we had this examples with the masses of exoplanet versus planet versus blah, 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 that then we could instantiate based on where the property comes from.
Yeah,
rather than having a type mismatch.
Well, so long as we know the data. Because the whole point is an entity type has the feature that it is a thing that conceptually can be stored in an entity store, and where the entity store is not terribly ragged, where the entity property value table of the entity store is not terribly ragged. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so assume that that's the case. So we have, astronauts, for example. They're, which space mission they were on, what, how many days in space they've been, right? All those kinds of things. Mr. Van Gogh doesn't get a days in space in any literal sense. Field, it's irrelevant. But so we've got, within an entity type, we have this somewhat rectangular collection of properties and values. Now the question is, what is the inheritance structure of one entity type to others? In other words, See, I think we're getting a little bit confused, because in the case of an astronaut, case of a person, a singular thing, right? Then there is a view of that singular thing as an astronaut. There is a view of that singular thing as a business executive, for example. But that's different from the situation where we have, where it might be a shark, that particular shark, the one that washed up on such and such a beach, versus a shark in general, or a shark of a certain species, and so on. Does that make sense? So I mean, I think there are kind of views of things, as in a person viewed as an astronaut versus a business executive. And then there are things where there's something about the character of the thing itself. A particular shark, named Fred, versus a shark of a certain species, and so on. I mean, then there's the average shark, etc. So how do we view? So I mean, this notion of a view of things, that's like taking a single. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, then we would have an entity, a person entity of whatever it is, Neil Armstrong or something, right here, and then that somehow would be. Then we would also have entity astronaut. And then that would have that name, and then we've got to associate one with the other, right?
Yep.
Now, perhaps what happens is that this has simply a property which is some kind of parent. It might not be parent entity. I mean, this is where it's more like a graph.
Well, the way we do that is by actually marking the entity itself as being a member of that particular entity type, right? It's the same. It to me at least, it seems like it's the same issue of Deion Sanders being an NFL player and an MLB player, but not an NBA player.
Yeah, I understand. So this one could certainly entrain, that it has various. Yeah, I don't know what they are. Related types or something.
Right, and usually it is a hierarchy. The thing that's tricky here is that astronauts can be persons, but of course there were also monkey astronauts. But yet not every person is an astronaut. So figuring out exactly how that hierarchy should work, it becomes tricky.
Yeah. Okay. Consider Laika, the astronaut dog. Okay, but you see, I'm not even sure. Again, this is part of our definition of things. Each one of these things would be, we get to document it. And when we say entity type astronaut, we can define that to be a human astronaut if we want to. But I'm not sure that non-intersection will always work. Okay, but let's go back here. Actually, we've got some interesting comments on the live stream. Let's take a look at these. Nicola says, natural language does not differentiate between an object and the property of it. Gold, for instance, is it a thing that has a property, or is it a property of something? But you see, I think that's natural language can be complicated because things which are used as, things can be used both as nouns and adjectives. We get to define what they actually, we're leveraging natural language, but we are making a precise symbolic language. And we get to say, for example, in the case of astronaut, is the definition, what I'm imagining is that for every one of these entity types, there is almost a legal contract that says what we think that entity type is, if that makes sense, right? And so, for example, in the astronaut one, we might say part of that contract, which hopefully one day we could write in our symbolic language itself, we are saying that, the astronaut is human, or the astronaut may be of any speed. I mean, an astronaut, presumably an AI cannot be an astronaut. Am I making sense? Anybody want to comment on that? I mean, so in other words,
is a paying passenger on a commercial spacecraft an astronaut?
Good question.
We are entering that era.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, so look, that's my whole point. My whole point is every one of these entity types gets a contract associated with it that defines what kind of a thing it is. And that contract will be written in English right now. Hopefully one day we can make it more, more symbolic. But for the time being, we write that, we define it, and it might change over time. Actually, our next comment from Cheesy on the live stream is, what if an entity changes over time? For example, an NFL player who's never played baseball now becomes an MLB player as well. Right. I don't think that's a huge problem. I mean, I think that
we have that case now
with companies, for example, right?
Well, I mean, even with the sports people, there are people who've played one professional sport and then they later tried another professional sport. We have data for them that covers the period when they were playing in one sport, and when they play in the other sport, we have data that covers that period.
Right.
Right now we qualify properties, and this works for most things pretty reasonable, but maybe in the future we have to qualify entities.
What do you mean by that?
Like the dated France 1980. it is as natural to consider it as a qualifier for France rather than a qualifier for the property GDP or population.
But we allow that, don't we?
You can wrap. You
Not
mean in
really,
the sense
not
that
really.
in the sense that you can wrap data around an entity?
Yes.
I mean, but that all that is a convenient way, because then that just
To move
gets
it over,
mapped over the
not really
properties.
inside.
Okay, so if I say this, for example, and then I say that GDP, for example, then you're saying that what's really happening internally is that that's turning into France, and then it's a dated property. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Okay. I mean, there's also, one could imagine things that change in space, can one not? What's an example of that?
That would be harder, I feel like, to define the identity of a thing if it changes in space.
Let me think about that for a second. Okay, here's an example. An amphibious car.
It's still the same entity.
Fair enough. I mean, it's just a different view of it. It's a boat.
Yes.
It's a okay, let's see. Nicola says a shark can be a person too, because we don't differentiate between things and properties. I don't quite understand that. I'm somehow reminded of that scene in the Finding Nemo movie that wait a minute, what was it? Fish are food? No, what was that scene? It says something like that. It's the equivalent of alcoholic.
Shark Tale.
Yeah, what is it? It's the.
That was neat. What if they're
It was Shark Tale.
friends, not food?
Friends.
Oh
yeah.
yeah, friends not food. Okay, all right. Okay. Carl says, I suppose the thing is that in Wikidata and so on, you can add properties like atomic mass to the Stephen Wolfram entity. You just have rules on the property that disallow it. Yeah, but I don't even understand. I mean, that has to do with the non-properties question of, a bird can't have fins type thing. Let's see. Nicola, the idea of contract is interesting because somehow it defines the entity use in the real world. Yeah, as Wittgenstein. Yes. This is a deeply, this is where all the Wittgenstein stuff, it's not a question of just talking about it. We actually have to write code. Okay, if you look at the position played on team / specialty, you can see how Wikidata handles temporal changes. Okay, we could look at one of those, I suppose. Oh, what a mess. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so there's a start time and an end time for each thing. Right, so we could imagine, I mean, yeah, I don't even understand that. I mean, okay, so there's the notion of discrete changes over time. How do we represent that? So that would be, e.g., and this relates to temporal logic as well, e.g., played in a certain position in 2001 to 2005, another position, or actually not even that, in a certain position, promoted to another position. How are we doing this for leader data?
Each time that the entities in the current leader data are essentially tenures. Like each entity is a particular person in a position associated with a particular country or whatever.
Okay, so that's the analog. So in other words, if we talk about the case of people, okay, then we might have, just like we have for books, the work, the book, the manifestation. Well, actually, this is generally hierarchies. So So we might say there, for books, we have the work, the book, the manifestation. And that would be, as we say, Gone with the Wind. Then the book is second edition hardcover. Maybe there's even a generic book, and then the manifestation is the British Museum copy, British Library, I guess it is now, copy. Right? And then for people, you're saying, well, there's people and positions. So we have a notion of what is it? It's complicated. We have a tenure, for example, e.g., a person in a certain position for a certain period, because they might be president twice or something, if I'm making sense.
Exactly.
Okay. And okay. All right, but I think we don't have really, and maybe we're getting this in the temporal logic world, we don't really have an equivalent. I mean, we have event series, right? And we have event series which has discrete events happening. What we don't have really is a what I might call a sequence of states series, if I'm making sense. That is, that you feed to it. It's like a piecewise, right? It's like piecewise. It says, given the time, given these intervals in time, this is the state of the system for these intervals in time. Discrete states, but in a sequence of intervals in time.
We have the time series with interpolation order 0, which assumes constant states between.
Fair enough.
But it's still a little bit too limiting in the sense of that it mostly wants kind of some numeric array-like object inside. It can't represent some more complicated state of things. Like the procedure that Andrew was working on is a little bit more in this direction.
Which Andrew?
Yes.
Okay. So I mean, there's this notion of a dated series, so that in which there are time intervals and there are states, roughly. I mean, that will be one way to think about this. This is sort of a form of categorical data, which one can imagine could be fed into timeline plot and all that kind of thing, right? I mean, because this is, what is the relationship between this and a date? Okay, so there's also the notion of a date interval, right? Which we're
working.
That's coming. Yeah, we're working on that, right? So that would be the thing that, but then a date interval and a dated series is a little bit like, it's not a recurring, a dated series could break up into a bunch of, it is date intervals together with payloads, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, I still think this should be representable by a time series with interpolation 0.
Yeah, I know, but there's no reason to call it that. It will just confuse the heck out of people to call it that.
But Jose, I think it's too complicated. Like, there's no reason that the various intervals are even mutually exclusive.
Well, but I mean, all the problems we are discussing about this dated series already exist in time series. So
but time series doesn't allow to have two things at one point.
But that's the notion of a combiner function. You would have to specify how to choose the first one, or.
But I'm not sure that Michael thinks there might be two overlapping things where like it is in two states.
Exactly. In the weeks right. where the NBL player trains for NFL, he's both.
Right. So at a particular time, the dated series might have a pair of values, e.g., e.g. CEO of company 1 and company 2. So, for example, if I say, what is this person's position? They might be, they might have a whole list of positions at a given time, which then at some later time would resolve to a single position, for example, or not. So in fact, one would suspect that the way this should work is that at any given time, so it's a thing, date interval. So what this would be is something where you ask for a particular time. I mean, actually, this could be done for like interpolation as well. I mean, there's a version of this that is just like interpolation. Okay, separate design. Okay, sub thing here. So what we've got, we could imagine something where it's a what the heck is this? This is what is this? Well, let's call the function foo for now. Let's say so you get what it's saying. It's saying for this interval, it's basically, I'm going to try this name. I don't think it's quite right. But so the notion is that it is a thing where you give it a list of intervals and that has payload 1, right? Is this like piecewise? Is this basically piecewise?
No, because piecewise basically we cannot have overlaps.
I see. And so then the idea would be
well, but I still disagree. So if piecewise resolves to return in different types, then this is like piecewise, right?
hold on 1 second here.
But the example that is right now on the screen, how would you resolve this?
Well,
what is the value at 4.5?
Exactly. So that's the question. So what do we want to return? What I'm saying is that once we decide what to return, we can write it with piecewise.
No, we can't.
No, we can't.
Yes, because we would say from 1 to 3.
Oh yeah, we can resolve it into a piecewise. That is
Exactly.
correct.
Yes.
But we can resolve it into a piecewise, but it isn't naturally a piecewise.
It's not. But it can be resolved too. So it can be represented as a piecewise.
Sure. So then the way this would work is this interval function would be given a particular value, say 5 or something, and then it would return a null list, or it could return a list with many, val 4, val 7, etc. Now, one might even want it, and this gets more complicated, to have a function, to have these things on the right-hand side not be values, but be functions of the actual value. All right, but let's come back over here. So then we might want and then there could also be a dated version as well. But this does seem somewhat useful, this notion of overlapping values. Now, of course, we could also imagine a two-dimensional generalization of this. And the 2D generalization we would have to have, instead of intervals, we basically have regions. Is this something, what about this for regions? So in other words, we're saying in this region, this is this is a sensible thing. Gosh, why have we not had this before? In this region, lions live. In this region, elephants live. What lives at this point? Get what I'm saying?
So I think this is a bit what the new polygons do. You have different types of polygons and you specify rules that say what happens in the overlapping regions.
Yeah, I agree. But I think this is a packaging. Okay, so okay, this is an interesting thing. We should put that off to one side for a minute. Okay, let's come back to our main topic. All right, so the issue is we've got a thing like an astronaut entity, and we want to be able to I mean, given that you have that thing, and now you ask for a property of that thing, like, for example, the age or the birth date of that astronaut entity, what should happen is that the birth date is a property associated with a person entity, and somehow that thing should be able to find in both directions. If you say, given the person entity, you say, how many space missions have they been on? Given the astronaut entity, what was their date of birth? Am I making sense?
Yep.
If a person were both, say, the basketball player and the baseball player, who keeps track of which one sports games are in, or do you get the combination of both?
Wait a second. If you ask a question, so there's okay. So each property is associated with a given entity type, right?
That's right.
So a given property is associated with an entity type, right? So if we say something like latest game or something, or sports games, whoever's typing, please mute yourself. What will have to happen ultimately is it's got to generate an assuming of some kind. It doesn't know otherwise. How could it know? In other words, if we've got entity, entity person, I don't know any sports figures. Sports, Mr. Sports. Okay, and then we've got entity MLB player, Mr. Sports. What is it?
NBA.
NBA. Okay. Okay. So then any property like latest game or something, or games played, would be an entity property of. Please don't type in our ear. Come on. Okay, oh, look at that. We've even got that property there. Okay, so that's that entity property. Now, if you ask for linguistically games played, so how does it work? What does it do? The natural language resolution of this, how does that work? So it's got to do an assuming, but the question is, does the assuming have to drill down? What is the symbolic version of, what games? That's a case where it has Mr. Sports played, right? And that has to have an aggregator which combines those two things, right?
That's right.
So in other cases, some cases there's an assuming, some cases there's an aggregator. Michael, or anybody else, can you comment on this, please?
I think right now that MLB player games played and NBA player games played are both separate properties.
Of course they are. Yes, yep. We know that. Of course they are. Right. So that's not my point. I mean, the question is, given that we start from person, right, we can know, and presumably we have this information in the surf, we know that that person has associated, that entity has associated with it these other entities.
Right. John's point is that it's intrinsic, that it's coincidental that the MLB player games played and NBA player games played properties just happen to have the same name of games played. And so you're not going to get the total if you ask for games played. You're going to intrinsically get the assumption.
Okay, but you know what? I think, okay, so here's a claim. Okay, so one question is
the question you're asking, what are all of the games in any sport this person has played?
Okay, the knitting of identical things, right? That's the real issue, okay? So, for example, is it the case that the second argument of entity, no, it's not the case. It's not the case. It is not the case. Sorry, it is not the case that the second argument of entity is always unique. Is always uniquely denotes a particular thing, right? That's the whole.
I would say it is.
No, because
it's not.
atomic hydrogen and molecular hydrogen are completely different.
Exactly.
But
Right,
the second argument on its own.
No, the second argument on its own means nothing.
That's
natural language type thing.
Yes, correct.
Right? So this entity there, element, hydrogen, etc. Okay. So this brings us to the whole question which we were talking about before, which I was talking about before, about equivalences between things.
If there was a type sports and the property games played was a property of that, and then the other sports inherited that property, then perhaps it could be.
It won't
exactly work. That's exactly how you get it to work.
You'd have an athlete type or something, right?
Yep.
It's not going to work. We can't always guarantee that kind of hierarchy.
So far with I guess the counterexample is the astronaut thing, where the question was whether astronaut should inherit from person or whether person should inherit from astronaut, because you could also have animal astronauts, and then you have the associated problem that not all persons are astronauts, and the way you fix that is you make astronaut be an abstract entity type. And so then you create an astronaut person entity type that inherits from person concretely and from astronaut abstractly. And you create an animal astronaut entity type similarly. And then it just works. So far we have no counterexamples where this kind of hierarchy doesn't just work.
I don't believe it's going to work. I think what we need instead is something where we can have, where somehow each thing can say.
So I still have problems with the sentence. It is not the case, because it is not the case in the sense of right now in your example or in a theoretical world. Because like John Smith, we don't have a John Smith. We have John Smith 1 to 412, and then it's unique. We can always make it unique.
Well, I'm saying I don't think it's a good idea to do that, because I don't think we want these.
That's a different story, but
right. So I think these two, it's perfectly reasonable that the standard names, and in fact desirable, and in fact what we've done for the last decade and a half, is the standard names here agree. The standard names, but yet these things, the whole thing is something different than this whole thing, although they share many properties.
I would say they share no properties but friends. That's it.
What?
It depends what you mean by chemical versus element.
I know. So maybe that's not the best example. We can take any of these examples, the work, the book, the manifestation, which happens to be probably a hierarchy there. Well, it's a hierarchy until the manifestation is a bound copy that includes 3 books. Right?
That's different than the person, the MLB player, the astronaut, because they are all manifestations, right?
I understand.
Yeah.
Look, people are special in the following sense, okay? And we get confused. It's like Schrodinger with his cat. By putting, the Schrodinger cat thing, one gets away with that because everybody sort of knows that a cat is either alive or dead. If it was, had this thing boiled or not, then physicists who talk about critical phenomena would say, well, I don't know whether it's boiled or whether it's, there's a coexistence thing between liquids and gases and so on. It's more complicated. People in the current state of the world are very distinct entities, right? Ignoring Siamese twins of various kinds and all that kind of thing. But people are a great example of a very unique, look, there are many kinds of things in the world that have this property. Like a lump of gold, for example, isn't really, it can be subdivided and it's 2 lumps of gold. Whereas, I think there are kinds of things in the world that have sort of registration IDs, like an airplane or something. If you cut the airplane in half, it's no longer, you don't get 2 airplanes. Right. Whereas if you cut the lump of gold in half, or even if you cut a diamond in half, you get 2 diamonds, but that name, the Hope diamond cut in half is not. Am I making sense? I mean.
Yes, but I feel like it's a practicality issue. Like a $5 bill. Every single one has a number, yet you're typically not interested in the individual one. Where for humans, you're only interested in the individual ones, and not all people living in Urbana.
I don't agree. You might say that was the theory. If you have an army or something, you're interested in sort of everybody in the 3rd regiment of whatever it is, and you don't distinguish necessarily. I mean, there are purposes for which you distinguish, and there are purposes for which we don't distinguish.
Right.
Or for example, you say a registered nurse, and that's a we need a registered nurse.
I would not consider this to be a person.
Okay. Well, fine. I'm telling you, I think the case of people, I mean, like airplanes, okay? You may not be personally, okay, this is complicated, right? Because an airplane, you think it's a Boeing 737. Okay, it's the same as another Boeing 737, but yet each one has a separate tail number. And do you want to consider those separate or not? There's some purposes for which you want to consider it separate and some purposes for which you want to consider it generically. And I think it's really the same. I mean, people, I don't know if I can construct as good an example with people. I mean, it depends on various aspects of ideology, how identical you want the people to be considered to be and so on. But I don't think there's a strong notion. There's a notion of the airplane with a particular tail number, and there's a notion of the airplane of a particular type. It's relevant what type it is, whether, if you're certified to fly that type, you can fly another one with a different tail number, but you can't fly a different type. But yet, if you're counting maintenance of airplanes, you care about the tail number. Okay, so where are we going with all of this? I think the issue is, like, even let's consider this case actually of airplanes. I want to consider that case. Okay, so airplanes of a particular type, of a given type, and then airplanes with a particular tail number. And I think even among types, it's there are airplanes of a general type, e.g., Boeing 737. Okay, here of a given, I don't even know how these are precisely done, but 737-800 or something. Airplanes with a particular tail number, I knew that plane once. Right. So that's a hierarchy of meanings to a plane. Now, what happens? What is our entity? I mean, we currently have, aircraft, and our aircraft is, I don't know do you have any idea how these? Well, let's take a look. If I say Boeing 737, okay. So I wonder what happens if I say, I think we understand that. No, total fail. What do you think it should? Boeing 737/800. We are oh no! What did that do? Oh, that is very confusing, guys. Look at this. Oh no! It just said that. Okay, I'm very confused here. Does anybody know how this works? Alan, anybody else?
My guess is that's probably a spelling, because aircraft data is a mix of classes and families of aircraft and different variants. That may just be a spelling for 737s in general.
Okay, so what do we do?
Because it includes variants.
Flight data. Flight data has. There's actually even more than that. A particular trip of a particular plane. Right. So
like
in flight
data, right?
What's that?
It's like leader data. It's a particular plane,
yes.
Particular plane on a particular route on a particular date.
Yes, but in flight data, what does it deal? It must return planes with tail numbers. Michael?
Yeah.
Is flight data in 12.1?
Not yet.
Okay, but how does it return those tail numbers? Are they entities or what?
Only at the level of the plane type.
Say that again. So then flight data has, like molecule, it is not imagining that every plane is a separate entity. Like, in other words,
correct.
Okay, that's a little bit complicated, because planes, obviously having every VIN of every car be a separate entity is a little crazy. How many cars are there? Like 1 billion cars or something? Maybe more than that. And we're also making the decision that planes don't have unique entity identifiers, but ships do, don't they? Right. I mean, a given aircraft carrier is its own entity. However, a cookie cutter, little yacht thing, we don't feel good about that being its own entity. Right? Does that make sense? Oh, Carl is pointing out on our live stream that actually we do have, oops, that's not what I meant, but he says we do have
You can say we have all the 737 variants, because I was just looking at that too.
Yeah.
There's
Apparently
there's an entity class of Boeing 737 aircraft, and there's 737-300.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so my slash was wrong. I mean, somebody should check that as a spelling question. Whether in fact the slash should be allowed. I don't know. I'm not an expert enough on these things to know. Okay, so we do have the 800 series. And yet, I doubt we have an inheritance mechanism between the 737 and the 737-800.
They're different entities of the same type, so there's no inheritance between them.
Although there might be an entity class of all Boeing 737 planes.
Yeah.
Okay. So in other words, are you telling me that if I say entity class here, aircraft Boeing 737, that will be a class?
That includes a number of members.
So if I then say entity list there, then I get a bunch of different kinds. Where's the 737 MAX? Maybe a curation issue.
I think it's grounded.
Yes, I know that. But so does that mean, great, what is it? does the spruce goose make it into? Okay, is the spruce goose a Oh, for goodness sake. Okay, so just because it, that's of course a singular, right? That is an entity class, but there's only one of it. But it has a designator, and for air traffic control purposes, it no doubt was, if they were even operating at that time, it would have been. They will have had some kind of type designator. Okay, so let's go back here again to, you have, so the question is, where did the designation of the entity come from? So it probably came from natural language, and you said Neil Armstrong, for example. And then so let's walk through essentially the flow of knowledge. Well, flow of let's just call it flow, because I don't really know what it's flow of. Okay, so you type Neil Armstrong. Okay. What you get by default is entity person Neil Armstrong, let's say. Makes sense? But now let's imagine, gosh, I am so confused here. But let's say, okay. Then the question is, if the input is, Neil Armstrong space missions, okay, does that become entity, person? Well, let's find out who he actually is. Hold on. Oops, that's not what I meant at all. Okay, there he is. Okay, so that is an entity. And then the question is, if I now say, so does that query become Neil Armstrong space mission? What is the actual, what's the actual, let's say.
Manned space missions, I believe.
Okay, all right, so that is probably not going, shoot, it does work. Okay, how does that work?
That works by calling an entity class in manned space mission data that is named for the crew members, right?
Manned space missions is just a property of person right now, right?
Yes.
Oh, that's horrifying. Right. Okay, so that's what we don't want.
This goes back to the thing you said at the beginning. Like, you think that we shouldn't have manned space missions, artworks, all these things for every single person.
That's what I think. Right.
Right. So that is what we have now.
Okay, fine. So let's talk about how we would avoid that. Okay. That then what would happen in this case is it would somehow have to indirect to discover that that's a property. I mean, essentially what's happening is it would have to say, if you ask for, okay, so it would have some kind of inheritance mechanism, person, manned space missions. Say, go look and see if there's an astronaut with that canonical thing. And let's say this would go to, let's imagine we actually have a slightly more general case, right? So this would then be an inheritance mechanism that says, if you're asked about manned space missions for a person, look and see whether there's manned space missions for an astronaut. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward so far.
Right. But so now, if we say, for example, okay, so now the issue is, let's take our friend, well, okay, we've got for species, we've got all the species in there, and then we'll be repeating them in the mammal subclass, in the mammal sub, we'll have a grizzly bear as a species, and then we'll also have a grizzly bear as a mammal, right?
I think that would be a bad idea. I would only have the grizzly as a mammal and then go up the tree.
Okay, so then would you have Neil Armstrong not as a person? I think that would be a mistake.
No, that's different because the person Neil Armstrong has properties that the astronaut doesn't have, but the species grizzly bear has no properties that the
yeah, that's right. Yep.
that the mammal grizzly bear not have.
Let us consider that proposition. Okay, I'm not sure you're right about that. For example, it might be very foolish. Let's imagine that there's a bunch of taxonomic information. Okay, it might be very foolish to replicate that for every mammal, for every reptile, etc., that we have this block of boilerplate stuff that is about its subtaxa, it's this, it's that, it's the other. And it might be better to have those associated with its species instantiation, viewed as a species in the Linnaean tree or whatever. These are its subtaxa, etc., etc., etc. But viewed as a mammal, this is its gestation period.
I don't quite see how you, in a natural way, differentiate properties that belong to a mammal rather than to a species.
Well, okay, so let's take the example, okay? Okay, so what I'm saying is species general properties, e.g. taxonomic tree properties. And then, what is Mammalia? Is it a phylum? Anybody know? Gosh, we're so poorly educated. Okay, well, whatever it is. I don't think that's right. It's a family or something, isn't it? Not sure. Whatever. Category, mammals. So here, e.g. gestation period. But now, what are you asking? If I say grizzly bear, okay, so let's imagine that I input. This is where it gets a little tricky. See, this is where I'm pretty sure we need to have this notion of, this is where I'm pretty sure what we've got is the x plus 1 squared versus, x squared plus 2x plus 1, right? So in other words, I might say, for example, if I say grizzly bear, I'm going to make something which is one word, koala, gestation period. Okay, it might be that wants to turn into entity mammal, koala, gestation period. Whereas if I say koala subtaxa, it might want to turn into entity species, koala subtaxa. So that is the same thing as saying gold ionization state, copper ionization state. Because if we say copper ionization state, then we're pretty much, we're talking about an ion. If we say copper, I don't know, atomic mass, we're talking about a single atom, right?
But if mammal inherits from species, then there's no difference between entity mammal koala and entity species koala. Except the only difference is whether or not you're making explicit that it's a mammal. But the infrastructure already knows that the entity species koala is a mammal and vice versa.
Okay, but so I claim that there are properties that might be different.
But then they'll have different names and that sort of thing. They won't.
No, they won't.
I don't.
No, they won't.
You
no,
think
won't.
it will have the same name and different values, and it's still a koala?
I do. Yes. Look. Here's how that can happen. Okay, so we say entity element copper. Okay, entity, and I'm going to this is what we talked about last time about proteins that do and don't have a hemoglobin that does and doesn't have its iron in there. Is it the protein backbone or is it the thing with the iron atom in there? Similarly here, if we have an ion, okay, then, and I don't know which,
but now it's a different entity.
What do you mean it's a different entity? Why is it a different entity?
Because copper 2+ is not the same.
Okay. Let's not use that example, okay? Let's use the example of, okay, let's try and use the hemoglobin example. And can somebody fill that in properly for me, what I'm talking about there?
It sounds like you've got two
no,
different
wait a minute. Is Jason here?
Yes.
Okay, so can you please tell me what what I think is the case, maybe I'm wrong, is that what we represent as a chemical might be different from what we represent as a protein, because let me give you an example here. Okay, if we ask what is the amino acid sequence here, the amino acid sequence does not contain the iron that's sitting in the middle. Is that a true statement?
This came up last time and I didn't look it up in beforehand. I do believe it does.
How can it? Okay, let me give you whatever, thyroxine or something that contains an iodine. There is no frigging iodine in any of the. If I'm not completely confused, there's no iodine in any amino acid. The iodine is not coming from there. The iodine it sits. It's like a little cage, and it gets an iodine. Maybe somebody on the live stream knows the answer to this. I'm pretty sure I'm right about this. And that the protein backbone. If I say amino acid sequence, right? There is a perfectly meaningful thing. There's shades of what is hemoglobin. You understand what I'm saying? There's hemoglobin as a protein. There's hemoglobin as a chemical. Am I making sense? And each one has a molecular mass, and they will be different. Or, I could go on many examples like this. And I think what has to happen is that we need this kind of mechanism where we say, this is the forwarding sequence. And maybe it's a precise forwarding sequence, or maybe it's better to say the result is approximately such and such. Let's say we have the data for the molecular weight for the protein case, but not for the chemical case, right? Better that we do something in that case and we just say, oops, we don't know.
But this argument does not, in my opinion, justify building the whole framework.
No, Michael, look. My claim is, okay, what is your claim about this?
No, I was just looking. So it seems to me like there isn't just hemoglobin, there are 50 different flavors fully specified.
Okay, fine. Yes, Brian on the live stream is saying, yeah, amino acids have no iron. Right.
Right, but so looking it up now, hemoglobin is a metalloprotein, which is the protein which has the amino acid backbone, and then there's a metal ion cofactor.
Okay, so then there isn't really a protein. The protein is some kind of globin thing, and this is something which is a complex of some kind.
Right. So the iron containing ring is the heme.
Okay, okay, fine, but the thing that I keep on claiming, and I'm pretty sure it's going to happen, is that we need to have this idea of forwarding from one. We think of something in this domain of discourse, right? Gone with the Wind. It's a book. Associated with that book is a work. And if you ask something like, who's the hero? Given the book, Gone with the Wind, 2nd edition hardcover, say, who's the hero? Okay, you forward that question to the work entity type, which knows the hero is whoever. You get what I'm saying? So my claim is what's needed is that you come in, if you're coming in from natural language, you come in with the best entity type for what you're talking about, but that entity type might forward to another entity type to resolve what the value of some property is, in certain cases. And that's, again, this view of the domain of discourse thing. What kind of a thing? And again, the criterion for what you have as an entity type is something where it's more or less rectangular. More or less all entities have all of those properties filled in. Now, a question is, what about canonicalization? What if you say, you've got something which came in as a mammal koala, and you've got something that came in as a species koala, and you say, well, are those the same thing or not? Well, the answer is, they're not really the same thing, but they are for some purposes the same thing. Okay, it's the same issue as, sodium chloride as a chemical versus sodium chloride as a mineral or something versus whatever else. For some purposes, they're the same, and some they're not. Just like x plus 1 squared and the expanded form are the same for some purposes, but not for others. So my claim is what's needed is a form of resolve or simplify or something for entities which can determine, with respect to this way of thinking about these things, are these the same? And depending on how you're thinking about it, they may or may not be the same. Like, for example, for some purposes, in particular for some properties, Gone with the Wind, the second edition book, is the same as, Gone with the Wind, the work. But for some purposes, it's not. Is this making any sense to anybody?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So my claim is that what we should be doing is, okay, so so then what does this actually look like? This means what comes in from natural language is one of these entities. If you propertyize it, but by the way, this would solve our problem with concepts from the image identifier and things like this, right? Because it would be the same type of thing. It would have a forwarding mechanism like this that says this property of this entity type forwards to this property of this entity type. Now, that forwarding arrow, okay, so there's this notion of forwarding. And my claim is that that notion of forwarding is that arrow should really have a footnote about what view of the entity allows this forwarding. Or alternatively, that, okay, so for example, yeah, in fact, that's the way to think about it. The way to think about it is that for a given entity and property, so we could say something like entity equal, well, entity equivalent. Maybe it's entity equivalent to Q, ent1, ent2, and then equivalence type. What's an analog of that? We've got several analogs of that, and certainly with distances, we have an analog of that. Do we have an analog with equivalences?
Don't think so.
Same test, maybe?
Yeah, okay, it's like same test, exactly. It's like same test. Right.
But it might be a little bit too limiting. Say, if you think in historical countries, it is not clear that there's a one-to-one map between entities, but maybe between groups of entities.
Okay. All right, fine. But the thing about entity equivalent Q is what we're saying is, given an entity of a certain type, if we ask for a property, then we have to decide, is it, when we ask for that property, we might want to qualify how we ask for that property using this essentially equivalence type thing. Because if we say, for instance, because sometimes we don't want to make that forwarding. Sometimes the forwarding is incorrect. Depending on how persnickety we want to be, the forwarding might be incorrect. Like for instance, okay. What's a good example?
Well, maybe I could try one.
Actually, I've got one. Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
The book and the manifestation. Okay. The forwarding. If you say weight of the book, right? The weight of the mass of the book. The mass of the book, as in the Amazon store is whatever, but the mass of the book that's in, let's say it was I don't know, some version of the Bible that was the mass of the book, the mass of the particular copy of the book that's in the such and such library, which has this leather binding, is going to be different from the mass of the generic Bible, let's say. Or, does that make sense? But for the purposes of, mass of book, well, it's a bad example. John, did you have a better example?
So let's take our friend, Mr. Sports. And if somebody asks, give me all of the points ever scored by Mr. Sports versus all of the touchdowns ever scored by Mr. Sports, even though Mr. Sports might have the same, it might be the same property for both NBA games and NFL games. One can't be aggregated versus the other. They have to be forwarded differently based on this equivalence context.
I'm confused by that, but that may be because of my lack of knowledge of sports. Alan, can you explain that in a way that I might understand?
I'm not entirely sure what John was trying to communicate there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I think because the number of points of a touchdown is 6, and points per basket in basketball can be 1, 2, or 3. If the person was a basketball player and a football player and you ask for the number of points scored, you're going to get a raw total of points versus the number of touchdowns scored. You're not going to get a number of points scored, but the times he crossed the goal line. Is that making sense? Am I catching on here,
higher
John?
Knowledge of sports than, but that's a good point. Okay, so number of points scored. Okay, so then there is the notion of sometimes there needs to be aggregation. Okay, e.g., points scored. I mean, it's kind of silly because the points are obviously not, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, that's I'm sure there are other examples that we can come up with.
Maybe there's a better example. I mean, this seems like a case where if we got asked that question, I would think that we would want to make the intelligent assumption that that person is interested in that person's football career. If by asking about touchdowns, they're implying that they have an interest in football, and the sensible thing would be to look at points scored for them as a football player, and not to do some weird aggregation over every sport they've ever.
Yeah, let's try and think of another case where there's useful aggregation. Okay,
but isn't that a different case? The baseball versus basketball, you have two different, more specific types that happen to have coinciding property names. So that's a different forwarding than going from the more general to the more specific one. Right?
Yeah. Well, no, but I mean, what we're saying is the whole point about forwarding here is that just like there's a person to astronaut forwarding, there also is an astronaut to person forwarding. Okay? We have to get the other way around as well. And sometimes it won't work both ways around. I predict that there will be some of these that only forward one way. That you shouldn't be able to go. I can't completely think of an example right now, but that you shouldn't be able to go from, in other words, that these are, notion of forwarding / equivalence. That is that you've got, yeah, I mean, let's take the other example, which is the image identifier. right? So the image identifier, I mean, we have this notion of, what are we calling them? Well, or for text cases, for example, we have the notion of what are we calling those things? Interpretation class? What are we calling that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, there's a documentation page for that. It's content type.
Can I look for that?
Yeah, if you go to text cases, there will be a.
Oh yeah, there we
It's
go.
a content
types. Okay. So now, how do these relate? How do these relate? And by the way, why on earth is that black and the other ones are gray? Bug.
No, because for now there is no Twitter handle interpreter types, but the bug has been opened and it has a suggestion.
Okay, fine. So we will add that probably. Okay, so how does this relate to what we've been talking about here? By the way, what on earth is that doing? What is that type there? That looks wrong.
Yeah, because this one has no also interpreter types, but there are some entity pages.
But why isn't there an interpreter? So you're using. I'm a bit confused about what's happening here, but let's not get into that rat hole right now. Actually, that's a very interesting thing. So a noun, we don't currently have an entity. We do have elephant as a word, don't we?
Yes. We have elephant as a concept entity too.
Right. So we have elephant as a concept, a word, and okay. So let me give that as an example. Okay. So down here we've got the elephant example. Okay. So we have it as a concept, e.g. for image identify, if I'm not mistaken, a word, and a species. Right. Anything else we have elephant for?
I think that's it.
But notice that elephant as a word, I'm not even sure that elephant is I don't know. Elephant as a concept or yeah, so this is a great example of what I'm talking about forwarding. Because if you have elephant as a word, and then you say what color is that? Most words don't have a meaningful color associated with them. Right? But elephant happens to have a color associated with it.
So, but this relation would be less on the type level, but more on the individual entity level. So a word entity knows which type it is about.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay, fair enough. That's a good example where this notion of forwarding that says, oh boy, what a mess. Okay. So in fact, I am wrong. No, I'm not wrong. Okay, no, I'm not wrong. Look. You know you have a person. You're asking about manned space missions about that person. Okay? Then you have to say, well, let's consider is there in fact an astronaut corresponding to that person? See what I'm saying? If yes, then find that manned space mission property there. Okay, consider the elephant example, right? So you've got a word, an elephant as a word, and then you are asking what's the color of it. So then what you can ask is there you're then having to look up, is there a related entity type for which there is a color property. Now, conceivably, there could be multiple entity types for which there is a color property. For instance, it could be, a chemical could have a color property, an animal could have a color property, right? So then what you do is you say, okay, for this particular entity, elephant, does it have a corresponding, a corresponding animal entity? Okay, great. Which has a color. Okay, great. It's gray. Okay. Does it have a corresponding chemical entity? No, it doesn't. So nothing to say there, right?
I'm not sure if it's so easy because the chances are we will not have an elephant as a species.
Well, what you're saying is the knitting, I was about to bring this up, the knitting of the correspondence between the word elephant, and the thing it means represented as a species entity might not be. Okay, so let's see what we actually have.
Exactly. Like for the person example, you can literally go by the standard name, but you can't do this for the other things.
Okay, so here, for example, we have, assuming African bush elephant, use elephants plural instead. Right. So the question here would be, let's do that again. The question here would be, if you have, right. So when you say elephant, which of those species specifications does it map to? Right. So that means, and if I look at what the input form of these things is, that's probably some complicated elephantidae. Yes, it is. And this is probably elephantida something or other. No, okay. Well, whatever. Okay. All right. So that's a good example. So what you're saying then is that associated with, okay, I think what's going to happen is this. I think, yes, it's very much like computed properties and entity stores. Okay, I claim. There are cases in which there is a generic forwarding that can be done. And there are other cases for which you have to define for each entity what that forwarding might be. Let me say it again. In an entity store, there is a notion of a computed property where a given property can be computed for any entity of that entity type, right? But there's also, we can say, let's add a particular property for a particular entity that is for a particular entity, not for a whole type of entity. So similarly here, I claim there will be forwarding that is appropriate for a whole type of entity versus forwarding appropriate only for a particular entity.
I think this particular case might not be so common or useful, because if you ask what is the color of the word elephant, well, it's indeed not applicable because the word does not have the color.
Being too precise, that's not what's going to work, right? For a particular entity versus a type of entity. See, this is exactly where we're going to get in trouble. Okay, Tony, you're trying to. Okay, here's my interpretation of that. Right? If you try and make the world axiomatic, it will fall apart. As in, you're right that the word elephant is not the same. Welcome to some linguistic philosophy or something. The word elephant is not the same as elephant as a concept, or or the elephant thing or something.
I have a more technical question. So in this example that you gave with the color of the elephant, so we have the elephant, say as a word entity, and now you want the color. What exactly do you mean by this? You apply uppercase color, or you have some linguistics?
Oops, what the heck am I talking about here? What the hell did that do?
It's at least approximately right.
It is approximately right, but how did it do that? Okay, there's elephant as a word.
Yeah. Okay, so how do you now continue with your color example?
Okay. So I'm claiming that if I say, for example, that subcolor.
So
Okay.
this means basically, so I wonder kind of like you use this color as a concrete standardized property name, or you use this color just as an uppercase version of normal lowercase color?
Doesn't that depend on whether you used a black pen, a red pen, or a blue pen to write it down?
What?
Because it's a word.
I understand. But okay.
Like it might well be that it's called skin color. You know, it's not obvious that it's called color.
I understand that point, but linguistically, look, that's what our parser does. Okay, so if I say color of an elephant, I have no idea if this is going to work, but let's say I say color of an elephant. That's absolutely mysterious how that worked. I have no idea how that worked. That might have been a one-off or something.
Right, it means it didn't have a proper path that we can show.
That's species data extras, right? Because not all of those those properties are exposed as to species data.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, so this very, very bizarre thing. If it, let's imagine that in that case we would have something that was using, something like an entity, species entity. I'm just writing this out.
And that's precisely the point. Is it's using the species entity and
exactly
ignoring the word entity, and that's the right thing to do. And in this case, you were referring to the species and not the word.
I know that. But what I'm saying is this. This is my whole point about entity equivalence and forwarding. Okay, let's say you got the word. It came out of NLP processing of some random piece of text. Okay, for whatever reason, you have the word. You've got the word because it's come out of a synonym tree or something. Okay, and it's really a word-like thing. And now you say, oh, by the way, I want the color of that. The color of the thing corresponding to that word. What I'm saying here is that we should have a mechanism whereby that, yes, you're right. You could be completely confused. You could really be thinking of that word as a word written on paper, a specific word as written by my pen. In which case, asking for color, that's where I'm talking about what type of forwarding, what equivalence type we're talking about here.
Right. So in that case, I think what you really need to do is interpreter of species, of elephant, of color.
I know, but that's not. But the whole point is we don't want to have to make people do that.
But words are not species.
I understand.
Your forwarding is also going to have to exist at the level of individual word senses.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. Look, you're absolutely right. A word is not a species. Okay. But what I'm trying to say is, my claim is that you can't make that what we have to do is have this notion that it is okay, there's two ways to think about this. Either you can do type conversion on the word and turn it into a species using interpreter and then go look up its property and then all's fine. But the question is there automated type conversion if you simply ask for the property? Okay. And what I'm claiming,
what you're asking for is more than that, because you're asking for reinterpretation, right? It's not just Neil Armstrong is both a person and an astronaut.
No. I this is the point I keep on making. Okay, the point I keep on making is that this idea of what an entity is. Sometimes hydrogen means the thing which is a combination of isotopes. Sometimes hydrogen, maybe that's a bad example, but sometimes you don't care that it's a mixture of isotopes. That's probably a bad example. Sometimes you care deeply that it's a mixture of isotopes. Okay, so depending on the context, depending on the domain of discourse, it can matter which, you can have to be very precise or not so precise. And what I'm claiming is that we want a mechanism for doing operations on entities that has, where you can somehow specify what level of precision you're trying to deal with. In other words, how pedantic do you want to be? because there are some applications for which no pedantry, like for example, like the speed of an unladen swallow, for instance, right? You can say, or the weight of an elephant, right? Okay, let's take weight of an elephant as an example. So it is my speculation, I don't actually know, that African elephants and Indian elephants have non-overlapping weights. I don't know if that's the case. Does anybody? Who knows? If somebody happens to know, you can say. But let's imagine that they do. They have a distribution of weights, and the distribution doesn't really even overlap. So were you to say, what's the weight of an elephant? What do you think you should get? I mean, we can see what we actually do right now. Okay, there we go. The African bush elephant. Now, if we were to say, okay, so that in fact doesn't even give us any choice there. So if I say weight of an Indian, is that the other type?
Where would you expect a choice? You've got buttons to choose an assuming.
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. Okay, so now, okay, well let's see what that assuming actually has in it. Okay, so actually they were about the same weight, so there's an irrelevant case here. But I mean, we can do something else. Words. Elephant. The input is a formula instead. That's totally weird. But what we're not offered here, which I think is perhaps wrong, is the weight of an elephant generically. So in the food case, we are doing that kind of aggregation, right? In other words, if I say, I don't know whether this will work, weight of a chocolate chip cookie.
You do get a choice for that from the first case, because your input was just weight of an elephant, not weight of an Asian elephant.
Oh, I see. You're absolutely correct.
You looked at the assumings for the case where you made a very specific input.
Okay, use elephants instead. Okay, so let's see what happens if I do that. That is bizarre. What did it do? Boy, if an elephant put on some weight, it's going to be out of range. What on earth did it do there? Everybody's mystified.
Yes.
Okay. I mean,
it's probably looking
different.
up something different.
Yeah, right. Okay, but in any case, the question that we have here, what is my point? I say weight of an elephant, or I deal with elephant, and I could need to be pedantic about is it an African or an Asian one, or I could want to be generic. And depending on what I'm doing, like if I say how many chromosomes does it have or something, or how many, what is its cytochrome C look like, or something like this, what does its gene look like, then I really probably care which one I'm talking about. But if I ask something like, does it have a trunk? It doesn't matter. How many legs does it have? It doesn't matter. Right? So I don't need to be pedantic if I'm asking for the number of legs.
But in some sense, you can only figure this out by either knowing some inheritance or by explicitly comparing the values.
Okay, well, let's talk about the aggregator for a second, okay? Because that's a different thing. So one thing is, okay, let's be clear, there is an elephant as a word, right? That's where we started, the elephant as a word. Now, the question is, what, okay, elephant as a word, and now we're trying to find out the cytochrome C, gene sequence for that thing. So that we will not be able to answer without asking for an assuming, without making an assumption. if we asked, okay, so what is different cases, right? So different cases of what happens. Okay, we can say, gene sequence. We can say, so that means that requires an assumption, requires choosing, or it has to return a list. Okay, the range either gives the union or requires choosing. Well, it optionally requires choosing. It probably gives the union. Where do elephants live? Right? Okay, so next case would be the weight. Okay, so there it could give the overall range, which is what we do for food, or could require choosing, or could return a list. Well, anything could require choosing, but it could. The most natural thing there will be to give the overall range, which is analogous to, where does an elephant live? You give the union of the places. So I claim, depending on the property, if there are multiple interpretations, so this forwarding notion is perhaps not right, because perhaps what should be happening is that elephant as a word should have multiple forwardings that it could go to. Yeah, this is the right thing. Elephant as a word has multiple places it can forward to. Okay. If you look for a particular property and that property is only valid for one of those forwarding directions, then that's what you use. If the property is valid for multiple forwarding directions, then you have to aggregate. I claim.
I agree conceptually. I'm still concerned about how concretely the property is spelled out.
Okay, well, let's come to that in a second. But so we've come to a partial conclusion here. So what we're saying is, given an entity, there may be multiple forwardings for that entity. If a given property is in several of these, it requires an aggregator. Right? Now, so the question then is, and actually we've already done this. I mean, we've aligned elephant as a word, at least elephant as a concept, we've aligned with elephant as a species, correct? What happens if I do the following? If I say picture of an elephant, okay, it's giving me an African bush elephant. Okay, hello.
Which is indeed aligned with the species data entities.
Okay, now I do an image identify on that, and I'm going to get, hopefully, why is this taking so long? An African bush elephant. Now, what is that African bush elephant that we see before us here? Okay, so that's a concept, but annoyingly, this one here, oops, this thing here, I predict is not. Oops, oh, silly me. Yeah.
Right. So with the output for image identify, if he asks for the equivalent entity, you should get that species entity.
Right. So %108 equivalent entity. Is that right? Right.
Yes.
Okay. And that will be the right thing. Okay. But this is what I'm saying is that we've already got, junior versions of this whole forwarding mechanism that I'm describing. That's So I'm saying what we need to do is to generalize this idea of equivalent entity, right? That's essentially what this forwarding mechanism is an equivalent entity thing. Does that make sense? And then okay, so then the question is, whether one allows a given forwarding may depend, on one's pedantry level, so to speak. Right? Given what one's trying to do, there may be a level of pedantry where one does not want to allow that forwarding.
And it also might depend on, let's call it, the depths of an entity. Like with this elephant, we have just two things, but assume the original entity would have been mammal, and the next question would have been, how do they taste? So we probably get 6 mammals back where we have a taste, and 800,000 where we don't have one. So what do we return after aggregation?
Okay, let's look at this one. Let's say taste here. Okay. I think that in that particular example, the aggregate, the only meaningful aggregate, will be an association of the particular results you get. Because generically, you can say, what does a seabird taste like? And my guess is, I don't actually know, and I wouldn't eat those things, but my guess is that they all taste somewhat similar at some level. Whereas, so in other words, what does a mammal taste like? Well, pork tastes different from beef. We make that distinction. I have no idea whether different kinds of rodents taste different. I don't particularly want to find out either. But you get what I'm saying? In other words, it's not self-evident that they don't aggregate.
But this is kind of like listing all cases, kind of trivial aggregation.
I agree. But that's look, this is the point. But the gene sequence, you probably can't. Okay. There's a very good case. The gene sequence is a good case because it could be that these species do not differ in that gene, that there is not a single difference in the reference sequence for the species for that gene. But it could be it could be riddled with differences. See what I'm saying? So if there's no difference, you just return the gene. If there is a difference, what do you do? Well, in the case of genomics, for SNPs, at least there is a notation, right? For it could be an A or a G type thing. But if you go beyond SNPs, if it's a more complicated transformation, I don't think there's a way to return it in the aggregate. But similarly, there's certain kinds of things that will aggregate, like an interval of numbers will aggregate, right? So I don't know how we represent, given, again, if we're aggregating two things, let's imagine that the Asian and African elephants, one of them was a pygmy elephant and the other one was a big elephant. Then the aggregation will probably lead to a bimodal distribution of weights, for instance. And then it's not obvious what we do. It's fairly stupid to say there's a range that goes from 100 pounds to 3 tons or something.
Right.
When it's mostly, there are the 100-pound guys and then there are the multi-ton guys. So, again, we can imagine an aggregator that, we can imagine an aggregator that will object if it sees things like the 100-pound ones and the 3-ton ones. It says, I won't aggregate those, but if it's a 2.5-ton one and a 3-ton one, it might as well aggregate those. So that's a whole set of aggregation choices, and we've got e.g. pygmy elephants. I don't even know if there are there pygmy. I think there are pygmy elephants.
I think there were.
Oh, that's right. You are correct. Yes, it's one of the extinct species. Okay, pygmy elephants versus big elephants. It's basically silly to aggregate weights. But Asian versus African weigh about the same. Actually, a good example of this would be dog breeds, right?
Yeah, I saw them.
Where how much does a dog weigh? Weight of a dog. So there, between the Chihuahua and the St. Bernard, let's see, if we say weight of a dog, okay, 2 to 160 pounds. By the way, why on earth are we giving 1.6 times 10 to the 2 there, as opposed to 160? Anyway, so if I now say St. Bernard, because I can't spell Chihuahua, great. St. Bernard dog. Okay, and now I say weight. Oh, look at that. Look at that. It's got male weight and female weight. And I bet if I just say weight.
This was exactly my point from earlier.
Okay.
That's why I asked exactly this question. Where do you get this string from? I feel like that's a critical question in the workflow.
Yeah, so you're saying if I simply ask for the weight of a St. Bernard, it's going to say, do you want a male or a female? Okay, so...
You would have to curate a whole new set of properties that are forwardable.
Well, we may have to do that. I mean, we may have to do something here. That's let's see, wait a minute. Property forwardability. Okay, so then we're saying weight versus male weight versus female weight, etc. So you're saying that for the St. Bernard, so if I say, let's take a look at what happens if I say weight of a St. Bernard. Oh, for goodness frigging sake. Who was he anyway? That is very silly. It should have noticed that it was a St. Bernard. Weight of a St. Bernard. Oh my gosh, look at that.
You didn't say where you wanted to weigh him.
What the heck is that? That's the craziest thing. Okay, that is a very, very silly result. Okay. Okay, let's look at the assuming here. Well, why did it do that? It's just completely crazy what it did there. Okay,
no,
why
it
did
it found a location, and for the location, it can use geogravity data to calculate location and get it mass.
Okay, well, that's very, very silly. Oh, I see. There it is, the height of St. Bernard, the city. And it's okay, but that is an embarrassing example.
Fully agreed. Yeah, everything clear.
Okay, but now in this particular case, okay, so then it's offering me female weight versus male weight. Yeah, that's really confused, that parse, by the way. Okay, but in any case, in this particular case, what you're saying is, yeah,
I feel like in natural language, we have enough layers in between where we can figure it out. But once we are in Wolfram Language and we have an uppercase string weight, now we have to do quite non-trivial work if there's not a...
Well, okay, so look, the fact is I'm cheating here because what we really should be doing is that should be an entity property. And just like the entity forwarding, there should be forwardability. What do I mean by this? Does that make sense?
But then the question is again, where do you get this? If you do it with natural language, there's a chance. But if you write the string, it gets hard.
No. I don't think you... Look, we might, as a courtesy, let you write the string, but I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think the right way to think about it is the correct form is a yellow box, brackets, a yellow box. Okay? There might be a courtesy of having a string there, but it is merely a courtesy. There's some precise meaning to that. So if it's a yellow box associated with a given entity type, because remember, the properties are associated with an entity type. So again, yes, it's the exact same thing. Look at this, watch this. This is going to be, let's imagine we say entity, hold on, I'm thinking here. No, what I'm trying to come up with, okay, is, and then this is an entity property for an astronaut, we don't seem to have. Okay, and then this is space missions or something. Now, okay, so that has to do some forwarding, right? Because there it's got to say, right, fine, can this person be translated into an astronaut? If yes, apply that entity property. But now imagine, and this sounds very sparkly, that there isn't a direct connection here. That is, that, what am I trying to say? Anybody understand what I'm trying to say? I mean, my claim is that in this case, it's fairly clear what you do.
Maybe not a direct subclass, but an indirect one.
Yo, give me an example.
A certain substance that is a medicine, which in turn is a chemical.
Okay, I understand. So this is drug dosage here, and this here is a chemical, for example. But even that would probably have a correspondence as well. Although again, you see, this is a good example: drugs and chemicals. Okay, people say, okay, let's take, I don't know what, something or other, which is a generic, right? That versus, I don't even know, aspirin, for example. I don't know whether the what is the salicylic acid or whatever it is, right? When you buy an aspirin made by Bayer or somebody, is it just a lump of salicylic acid? No, I don't think so. I think it has a bunch of other crud in it, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Especially
there's
because,
binders.
for example, extra strength aspirin contains a delayed release because you don't want that full dose all at once. And yet everybody thinks that they should take the extra strength because there's more aspirin in it.
Okay, that's interesting. But okay, so that's a good example then of something where, again, it's a level of precision question, a level of pedantry question. If I say, and this is perhaps a bad example with drug dosing because one probably wants to give lots of assumings to get that right, but let's imagine it was the molecular weight of aspirin. Is it the average molecular weight of all the things in the aspirin pill? Is it is it salicylic acid? Is that the right name? I forget. Anyway,
Acetosalicylic acid?
I don't know. I don't know anything about chemistry. Well, actually, this is a chemical, so that's, who knows what this is. Okay, so what do I say if I say aspirin as a drug? Or do we not know that because it isn't a prescription? What do we do in that case? We say as a chemical. That's weird. Well, okay, whatever. So then we must have forwarding in this case, because I bet we have some things about toxicology. Or, well, what do we have here? I mean, in other words, does this have drug properties as well?
Right. So long ago, there was a separate packlet for drugs, but before I got here, it was folded into chemical data. So there are plenty of entities in chemical data that will have just missing properties for all the drug properties.
I see. But if I take a drug, I don't know what, what's that? Oh my God, what's that common?
Tylenol, right? That's good.
No, I want something which is really definitively a drug. What the heck is that standard antidepressant? Prozac.
Right, and so that parses to the active ingredient. They were aligned that way, but rather than whereas ideally you would have a separate entity that was for the drug Prozac that would be aligned, that would have a property pointing to that chemical.
Right, which is again what we keep on saying, because at some level, Prozac means fluoxetine, right? Which has a molecular weight. It has this and that and the other, right? It has, molecular structure, all those kinds of good things. How big a molecule is it? I'm just curious. Oh boy, it's big. No, not so big. Interesting. Okay.
But the fluoxetine chemical wouldn't have ideally, it wouldn't have a daily recommended dosage property.
Yeah, it wouldn't have a packaging property or a pill shape property. Right, but if you said fluoxetine, pill shape, what should we do?
So if we did have separate entities for them, they should be aligned and they should.
Right, but then it's got to forward, because it's got to be a level of pedantry. There's got to be a pedantry level defined, because you could say fluoxetine, pill shape, that doesn't mean anything. Or you could say, oh, you must mean Prozac pill shape, and be happy with it. Right?
Right. I think you'd have to go further to dosage forms. Right. Depending on whether it was like 10 milligrams or 50 milligrams.
Yeah. Right. But okay, fine. So that's a case where, in that particular case, the aggregator, by the time you're asking pill shape and it's got a drug, then the aggregator has got to decide what to do. So, for example, it could be the case that, all Prozac pills are green, right? In which case you can just say, what's the color of a Prozac fluoxetine pill? It's green. All good. But it could also be that the different dosages are different colors, and then it's got a whole different thing to go over. And then the aggregator can't just return. I mean, one thing that's awkward to me is in this aggregator business, as you write a program, the thing that bothers me is that, if it could be a single thing, or it could be a list, or it could be a interval or whatever, that's very hard to deal with in a program. And it bothers me that, the alternative is to say that the return is always, I think what we're going to have to do is use the third argument of entity value, because that is you got what I'm saying about, in a sense, how pedantic is the aggregation? Sometimes it'll just be, give me a thing, the best thing you've got. Another time it will be, give me the most information you can. Am I making sense? So I think that's another, so there's a level of pedantry for aggregation, i.e., give maximum information, e.g. an association or something like this, or give it your best shot, etc. We unfortunately have to wrap up soon here, but although we're really on a roll, and I would like to get a few people's opinion. I actually think we're actually getting pretty close to something reasonable here. Michael, some summary from you.
I think that sounds all very good. I'm still not so quite clear how we concretely want to go forward, honestly. Like, one of the original things was discussing the entity types, like do we want to create new ones?
Yeah, I think the answer, I think we're not going to get to all of this today, but I think what we've got here is we've got a new kind of superstructure, which is this forwarding mechanism. We've got basically the decision that we should break entity types up more than we have now. We should re-break some of the things that we tried to aggregate before, because remember the criterion for an entity type. An entity type is something where the property value table is roughly rectangular and not too ragged. So, for example, in the case of drugs, you can't aggregate the entity type of drugs and chemicals, because drugs have all kinds of properties that most chemicals don't have. Does that make sense? Therefore, by the definition, by our sort of contract about what an entity type is, those should be broken into separate entity types.
Yes.
Okay, so similarly, for the different types of, mammals versus birds versus whatever, those should be broken. Now, it could be, and the whole point is that we have to allow the possibility. I mean, we also have to think about future compatibility and so on in a world where, let's imagine that somebody thought that, here's a typical horror. Okay, the taxonomists fight, and they eventually decide that no, a koala is not a bear. You understand what I'm saying? So in other words, it used to be that a platypus was considered a reptile or something, but now it's going to the duck-billed platypus was considered I don't think that's right. I don't even remember what it's it's on the border between mammal and reptile. And so somebody or let's say Pluto as a planet, right? Pluto used to be a planet, but now it isn't. How do we deal with that? In other words, if somebody had the entity planet, Pluto, in fact, what on earth happens in that case right now? Compatibility. Okay, so let's try that. Entity, planet. What did we do in that case?
I think Pluto is a minor planet. No.
Well, it is a minor planet now, but maybe the degrading of Pluto happened before we defined our entity types. But you understand what could happen there.
Yeah.
Right? We define it, Pluto as a planet, and then some bright spark, the International Astronomical Union or something, suddenly decides, no, that's wrong. It's actually a minor planet, right? So then what do we do in that? I think we have to expect that going forward, we will always maintain the previous entity because somebody might have code that contains that burnt-in entity. And we probably want some mechanism for obsoleting an entity, but it can't be, maybe it generates a message or something if the entity is used. I don't know. But that's another thing we have to think about. Okay, could I just ask a few other people who are here their opinions about this? The natural language processing folk. Jerome is still here, or Jerome, looks like Jerome dropped out.
I'm here, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do you have any opinions about this?
Yes, I mean as well. Actually, things that discussed here recover a bit our needs for text cases as well. So hierarchy, it's pretty clear that we'll need a hierarchy. Also, the fact was discussed in the beginning, for example, that mammal can also be an entity. This happens. I mean, we can see that for text cases, we might want to say not necessarily a specific entity, but something a bit more like a type. Like I want we could say all the infrastructure, like named infrastructure, like this building, these things, or all the infrastructure type, like finds all the mentions of a bridge or anything else.
Wait a minute, you're saying. I'm confused here.
So I don't know if it's clear. It was things we discussed that was mentioned in the middle of the meeting, and I thought this would be useful for text cases.
Well, let's take animals versus mammals. Okay, you might easily want text cases to say, "Find me all the animals mentioned here."
Yeah.
Is that the kind of thing you meant, as opposed to find me all the mammals?
Yes, but like if it's written squirrel, we might want to have this rather than an existing mammal that has a name. I mean, yeah, in that case, that would work. Yes. But in some cases, ambiguity. Like for infrastructure, there could be some infrastructure that have a name, right? And some.
Okay. So what you're saying is, okay, it's a good, interesting case. All right. So let's say text cases. All right. Find me all mammals in the passage. Okay. And then the question is, does Lassie, okay, so one thing is the St. Bernard or the Golden Retriever, whatever it is. And another thing is Lassie. I know it's spelled like that, isn't it? Or Leica or whatever. right? Those are specific named dogs.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting case. Would you want, if you said, find me all the mammals, do you want the particulars like Lassie? I think you might reasonably want that, but that's pretty interesting actually. That because that's a, one is find me all the mammal entities, because Lassie is not a mammal entity. Lassie, what is Lassie? Lassie is a famous animal or something. Is that right, Alan? Do you remember?
Sorry, Latya, famous organism.
Did I spell that right? How is that poor
I don't know.
dog's name spelled? Okay, Lassie is a fictional character, but let's see if is that the only.
Yeah, Lassie was not a real dog.
I know Lassie wasn't a real dog, but I mean, okay, let's take a. What was the name of the dog on the Russian spacecraft thingy?
It was Lyca, you're spelling it right.
But I think that do we not have famous organism exposed in the language? It's possible.
But you think it's in Wolfram alphabet, not
It is, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so that maybe is not. Okay, so that's a bug basically that isn't exposed.
Yep.
Okay, but that's a particular anyway. So the issue is, should you? Right, that's actually a pretty interesting case because mammals, where Lassie, we characterize as a fictional character whose type happens to be dog.
Yeah. So yeah, in the text cases ontology, I mean, this is kind of a tentative data-driven ontology. We would have a different entity type. Like you could have infrastructure.
Yes.
That would refer to the specific named infrastructure, and infrastructure type that will have bridges, I mean, a bunch of words that are infrastructure words.
Yeah, right.
We could have also concepts. I saw some annotators adding, I don't know, of a field like mathematical concepts or physics concepts. So infrastructure concept would kind of work as well here, but.
Right. That's a separate discussion about the NLP concept annotation thing. Okay, fine. So that's interesting. All right, comments from other people. What about from Tony? Do you have any graph database comments here?
Just one thought about one of our last paragraphs about the identifiers and the stability. This is tricky because we are talking about the type first and then about the entity. If we want stable identifiability, we would need something like optional typing, which would be something like just the identifier for the thing. And later we have a property that says, okay, it's of that type and that type and that type.
No, I don't agree. I mean, look, at the time when, okay, let's imagine Umanuma or whatever that thing was called, the asteroid that went through the solar system, whatever it was, right? Let's say at first that is identified as a comet. Then it's identified as an asteroid. Then it's identified as something else. I don't think there's a problem in us saying it's an entity, a comet entity. Now, we might want to say that that entity has been deprecated, but that doesn't mean that the entity, I mean, this is a question, I don't know, it's one of those classic philosophy type questions, right? Isn't the classic one, the King of France is bald, but France may not have a king, and that, there's a sort of failure of reference type thing. But I think what we should do is perfectly happily say, great, it was maybe that's a different issue actually, now that I think about it. Although that is an interesting case for us, this King of France thing, because what on earth do we do in that case right now? Funky. I mean, not completely crazy, But what happens if we ask for? But if we asked for King of France, does this yet work in 1678? Does that work yet? No, not yet. That will work, right?
Right.
I mean, that will
What
work.
we do on the website is we give a data not available, but then there's a pod that's entrained that says who the current leaders of France are, what those titles are, and who the people are who hold that position.
Right. Okay.
And
All
it
right,
also
so-
gives another pod with the kings.
Fair enough. That makes sense. I mean, that's a very good thing to do. But for purposes of our entity framework, I think that something which is identified as a particular entity type, but then the world's wise people get together and decide it isn't actually of that entity type, that doesn't seem to me to be a fundamental problem. Is that what you were referring to, Tony?
Yes. Because by definition, Pluto is not a planet anymore, and deprecating it seems a little bit, like a mistake. If something is deprecated, it looks like a mistake has been made.
Well, it is a mistake. It was a mistake. I mean, the whole Pluto planet fiasco. I mean, who knows what one? I could tell you some backstory to that, but anyway, let's not do that. I'm almost led to tell a funny story, but anyway, the person who was responsible eventually for deciding that it should be deprecated had gotten into astronomy as a result of interacting with the person who discovered Pluto. There's a bizarre factoid for you, but there's a bit more to that story. But anyway, if we have an entity called Pluto as a planet, it once was considered to be a planet. It's not embarrassing to us to have that entity be present in our system. And if that entity perhaps generates a message saying, actually, this thing has been deprecated, you should refer to it as a minor planet instead, then you're doing pretty much exactly what the pedants would want you to do, aren't you? I don't see a problem with that.
I'm not convinced. Like, maybe say at a linguistics level, but returning it if you ask for the planet would be totally wrong.
Returning what if you ask for the planet?
Pluto.
Wait a minute. Okay, let's imagine that at time t, okay, how does that thing get pronounced? Anybody know how to pronounce it? Umanuma, whatever it was. You guys know what I'm talking about. The cigar-shaped reddish thing.
Yeah.
Okay, which had a really silly name. I think these things are intended to be, okay. So let's imagine it was Umanuma. Okay, nobody knows what it is, right? So maybe somebody will eventually have a classification, interstellar asteroid or something. But right now, that thing would be considered what? An asteroid, probably. Could be considered a comet, perhaps. But what it is in the, if we have Umanuma as a comet, and later on the International Astronomical Union says, well, actually, it's an interstellar asteroid, we've made a new category, so what? So we just say that those things, it gets a forwarding to the interstellar asteroid category. And perhaps if somebody were to have a piece of code that used the comet designation, we might want to warn them with a message saying that they should really use that other designation instead. But if it came from linguistics, we'll simply change the interpreter and it will now go to an interstellar asteroid type.
That's all fine. But if you do some statistics on planets, you don't want to be off by one planet.
Ah, good point. Okay, that's a good point. All right, so then, okay. Yeah, what if you ask about planets in the aggregate? I mean, that, I'm afraid, is revealing the difference between an entity class and an entity type. Well, I'm afraid that this is a different topic. I think. I mean, the main issue here is going to be classes of things versus named types of things, and that's going to end up being an issue. I agree, because I would claim that planets is more accurately a sort of computable class rather than it's, in other words, there's the notion of where did the name come from, and then there's the notion of what are its, what type of thing is it. So for instance, what's a good example? I mean, there must be, okay, here's a question. Does anybody know the answer to this? In the world of taxonomists, if they get it wrong and they call it a, well, actually, yeah. So I know in ordinary, there are things called things like the false melon volute. There's a type of oh, weird. I thought that was a thing. It's a that's really weird. What it did there was really weird. Anybody understand that? Let's see whether we know what a melon volute is. That's really weird. All right, let's try my favorite. Somebody hasn't done linguistics for mollusks. Well, that's not good. Alan, I think that's in your area.
I didn't see what you were putting.
Probably in mine.
Yeah.
All right, a bit of an embarrassment with some mollusks there. But in any case, the what happens in in common names is you get ridiculous things like the false melon volute, which is a type of mollusk. And it's called that because it was often misidentified as a melon volute. And then it got the weird name of the false melon volute. But the question is, the underlying Linnaean, binary nomenclature classification, if they discover that it actually isn't a melon volute, what do they do? Does anybody know? Michael, I'm pretty sure years ago we talked to various taxonomists when we were first trying to do this.
I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember either. So I mean, okay, but that's the same, I mean, like for example, it must be a lot of genetics. So we can look that up, but it'd be interesting to know. I mean, do they leave it in the wrong place or do they try and move it? And if they move it, what happens to all the specimens that are in jars with labels written in the 1880s? Right? I mean, one assumes that there must be a forwarding mechanism because, the jar that's sitting there that has the thing in format, in formalin or whatever, their wonderful type specimen that's sitting in the in the basement of such and such a natural history museum is going to have a particular label, even if they got it wrong. So I think we have the same issue. Okay. Any further comments from Tony?
Well, there was I had this thought about those dated things, but if you want to discuss that now.
Let's not discuss dated. I mean, yeah, okay. So Mohammed on the live stream is suggesting that dated of entity, planet entity Pluto, common now, could return the minor planet. Brian is telling me how to pronounce this Hawaiian name. Okay. Oumuamua. Oumuamua. Okay, thank you. I will try to remember that. Oumuamua. And it's Hawaiian. Okay, that's interesting. Okay. Let's see. Enter themselves be dated. Yeah, Muhammad is suggesting just as entity property can be dated, it would be nice to have entities themselves be dated. Yeah, I mean, we discussed that actually earlier in the session. We agree about that. But the notion that an entity, that's an interesting idea, that see, but that's not going to solve the problem. I mean, even if we said dated of entity, planet, I claim this is going to get as messy as any of these other things. If we try to say, see that, no, this is not going to work. Goes to the minor planet case. That's not going to work, because if we say dated of, what's a good example? Dated of Carthage, the historical country of Carthage. Now, what does it give? What should it give? What is the corresponding, and then the question there is, what is the modern dated version of Carthage? Isn't Carthage in what's now Libya? Is that right?
I believe so.
Is this going to default to the historical country? Is this going to do the right thing? Yeah. Oh, cool.
Apparently it's in Tunisia.
Oh, but look at that. What a mess. What are we going to give? See, look at that. They captured pieces of, that's right. In fact, one knew that. They captured pieces of Italy as well. So that raises the question, so you say dated entity, historical country, Carthage, now, what does it give? Complicated. Anyway, and even more, but dated entities is clearly a good idea. Okay, who else would like to comment here? Anything from the, Aaron or Josh, anything from you guys?
One thing that I wonder about to maybe kick around a little bit is how we can use the backbone of concept data for aiding these crosswalks. We already have, like we saw with the image identifier of the African elephant, the equivalent entities and such, and we can expand on that and hang a lot of things off of concept data entities, and we already have a hierarchy built in there.
Yep, I agree. That's a good point, that those already have a hierarchy. I mean, I agree, there's going to be a big curation effort of these forwarding things, but that's a good place to start.
Yeah, a lot went into making that, and still needs some work to clean up the hierarchy a little bit, but it's not work I don't think that we should cast aside. And
by the way, that hierarchy stuff, does Jerome and Etienne and so on, do you know for Texas, do you know about that hierarchy stuff? Like the notion of an animal that's a hierarchy above elephants and rhinoceroses and so on. Are we using that in the case of...
Not yet.
But were you aware of that, or is that not...
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something we see from the data that might be useful to have.
Okay, fine.
And we are discussing with people in the curation team about this.
Okay, all right. Okay, other people with comments here. Any comments from the mathy folks who are here? James, Ian.
I think this forwarding thing is a good idea, but it doesn't address my use case, which is reasoning about the relationships between classes themselves.
Example?
Like topological space properties, you could have a class of house store spaces and class of T1 spaces, and there's like arbitrary logical relationships between them. So you might want to say that such and such a space is in certain classes and automatically deduce what other classes it is and is not a member of.
Okay, let me think about that. So your point is that in the world of, in most of these things, like the classification of animals, is simpler than the classification of topological spaces. It has less structure than the classification of topological spaces. Is that the meta claim?
Well, it's hierarchical, whereas the relationship between topological spaces is not hierarchical. Like you can say that some classes are subclasses of others or equivalent to intersections of, you know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah, I understand. So this is mathematical data, mathematical knowledge, and the hierarchy is not so relevant. It's less relevant, and there's a more complicated set of relations. I mean, obviously, we know, let's say, computational complexity classes. We know that, P is in NP and things like this. I mean, that's another absolute can of worms, is things where we don't know if there's, P versus NP, is it strictly inside, or is it, subset or subset equal? That's another can of worms of things that aren't known like that.
Right. That was why I brought up the example of woman, mother, and parent. That's the basic kind of relationship you would see. Like I tell you that someone is a parent and a woman, and I want to deduce that they are a mother.
Okay. How general? I mean, where else? Okay. We've got parent and woman implies mother.
It's equivalent.
Right. It's equivalent both ways. For now. Depends on the state of... I don't even know.
Let's not get into gender politics. Right?
Oh, right. Okay. Okay, but all right. So, but what do you think? So, what would you like to have for your mathematical purposes? Is there some aspect of this? I think maybe that's a separate discussion. I mean, okay, so that's an important thing that we've pinned on the side.
Yeah, it should be separate.
Okay.
Separate discussion.
Okay. Anybody else here want to make comments before we wrap up this meeting?
I have one more analogy. Probably most people will not agree with it, but I think there is one. For me, an entity is a little bit like a pure quantum state in the following sense. You have a wave function, and it 100%, assuming it's a pure one, not a mixed state, it 100% describes the thing. But without having a commuting set of operators that define what you measure, there's nothing what you can say yet about it. You need properties that describe the thing and that measure. And this commuting set of operators, as we know from Kochen-Specker, can be even mutually so that you can do different things, and one property is not enough to fully specify the other ones.
Well, there's parts of that analogy that do seem reasonable. That is, you don't know what you have until you start asking. In other words, you don't saying there's a notion of an entity, and you don't know what you have until you start asking about properties of it.
No, you don't know exactly what you have. The wave function is all what you ever have. There's not more than it. You know everything, but you don't know any of its property in some sense.
Okay. All right. So where do we go with this analogy?
That kind of like it's like this different kind of forwardings and how to view things. It's a complete commuting set of operators that you measure on it.
I see. So your concern is that essentially that we are going to burn in something which denies some entity analog of entanglement.
Yes, yeah, that's not a bad phrasing. Yeah. Or that basically, which is already fully specified. It doesn't allow things like just measuring the energy. We also measure the angular momentum. Yet we have not done so much specification yet.
Well, I understand. So you're saying if you say, what does it weigh, but you haven't said whether it's African or Asian as an elephant yet. Is that what you mean?
No, it's more like some of the properties might be like the thing is already specified, but the properties are still fluffy with respect to forwarding.
I don't understand.
Okay, I will come up with some examples for next time.
Okay, but I mean, the main issue that we have, look, the main meta point here is we don't want to burn into our framework some assumption about the world that simply isn't true.
Definitely.
Now, to be fair, in all these years, our basic entity property mechanism, while it has, creaked around the edges, and that's what we're worrying about right now, we have been able to successfully describe a lot of stuff with it. And, in a sense, weird corner cases, we probably can get around the weird corner cases, and there will be weird corner cases. I claim it's inevitable there are weird corner cases. Is it a solid or a liquid? Is it a, oh no, it's a glass, whatever. Fair enough. All right. Well, we should probably wrap up. I mean, this is about as close as you get to, applied philosophy or something. I mean, this is there's probably it's kind of lovely actually how philosophically complex a bunch of these things get. Oh, somebody asked on the live stream, any countries with common intersecting borders? I'm not sure I understand that. It better be the case that countries are disjoint. I think that's the nature of, no doubt military. Actually, it's a question: do military conflicts align themselves with the borders of historical countries? Who knows? And I see. You're talking about like the demilitarized zone, and what the heck do we do with that? What country is the DMZ in? Alan, that would be for you.
Or like regions of international airports.
We punt mostly. I mean, if they're the genuinely disputed areas, we have a definition of those particular areas.
Yeah, but I bet the treaty that established the DMZ, I wonder whether that's in both, whether that's considered to be in South Korea or North Korea.
The DMZ is in both countries because there's a specific building that sits on the border where they can come and have conferences.
Okay.
And half the conference tables on one side.
Fine. Well, okay, but okay. So if half
it's a different kind of entity.
Yeah, but right, but that means there is a border line. It just happens to be the case that building straddles the borderline. So it is not the case that that there's a given lat long coordinate which is in two countries. And I don't.
I thought this is what Ben just said.
What did Ben just say? That there's a place, there's a lat long coordinate, where if we say geo, where if oh my gosh, what a mess. Okay, well we say geo identify of that it should return two countries.
I mean, there must be some representation of Banach-Tarski in geography.
Yes. I knew you were going to bring that up, Michael. It's right. Ignoring issues of the continuum. I mean, yeah. Well, anyway. All right. Well, we should wrap it up here. Thanks all. We'll obviously need to go on, but I think we've made some good progress. And thanks to everybody in the meeting. Thanks to folks on the live stream for all kinds of comments. And until the next time, see you all soon.